as we saw in another lecture in this series, although most people tend to think of true crime as a 20th century phenomenon, in fact, the roots of the genre stretch all the way back to the execution sermons of the Puritan era. In this lecture, we'll focus on modern forms of true crime, which are integrally related to mystery and suspense fiction because both genres draw upon fictional and nonfiction techniques to achieve their effects. The two genres are also related in more obvious ways. They are both centrally concerned with crime, and critics have disparaged both of them as trivial and even damaging to their readers. With these points in mind, looking at modern true crime texts gives us an opportunity to remind ourselves of the importance of formula in the success of mystery and suspense fiction, along with the influence of the frequently blurred line between fact and fiction in these narratives. But what exactly is true crime? Let's begin with a simple definition. True crime is a nonfiction genre in which the author uses an actual crime and real people as a point of departure. The crimes almost always include murder. They can be fairly factual or highly speculative and heavily fictionalized, depending on the writer. Some works are instant books, produced quickly to capitalize on popular demand, while others may reflect years of thoughtful research and inquiry. Still others revisit historic crimes or alleged crimes and propose solutions, such as books examining political assassinations, well-known unsolved murders, or deaths of celebrities. Almost every part of this definition could be and has been contested, but it's a useful starting point, not least because it indicates that a wide variety of materials could be classified, albeit loosely, as true crime. All of these materials claim to be factual accounts of crimes and their perpetrators, and all of them use various fictional techniques to embellish or enhance the effect of the stories they tell. From the very beginning of the genre, then, the question of what is true about true crime has been very relevant. Even though modern forms of true crime draw in various ways on earlier materials, Edmund Pearson is the person primarily responsible for moving the true crime genre into the modern period. Beginning in the 1920s, Edmund Pearson seemed to succeed almost single-handedly in raising true crime narratives to the level of literary art. How did he do it? Edmund Pearson came to true crime as a bibliophile and aesthete. A librarian by trade, Pearson's early publications were mostly about books and book collecting, an interest that was facilitated by his position as editor of publications at the New York Public Library from 1914 to 1927. The shift in Pearson's career, where we see his interest in crime emerge, can be located quite precisely in the final chapter of his 1923 book, Books in Black or Red, entitled With Acknowledgments to Thomas de Quincey. De Quincey was an English author and essayist who had written a very famous essay in 1827 entitled On Murder Considered as One of the Fine Arts. Pearson saw in De Quincey a way to have a legitimate interest in crime. Using the blueprint established by De Quincey, Pearson published a series of hugely successful true crime books, beginning with Studies in Murder in 1924 and concluding with More Studies in Murder in 1936. The success of Pearson's work gave true crime narratives a status they'd never before enjoyed. Rather than being associated with the penny press or cheap forms of street literature, Pearson's true crime narratives typically appeared in high-class magazines such as The Forum, Liberty, The New Yorker, and Vanity Fair, before being published in book form. Pearson made it possible for true crime to come out into the open and take its place with other legitimate genres. Pearson presented himself as a connoisseur of crime, only interested in what he called, in his 1923 essay on De Quincey, the pure murder. Pearson wanted to make crime narratives safe for respectable members of society, and that meant rejecting the sensational, including serial killers. Given all the crimes Pearson excludes, what is left to constitute a pure murder? He addresses this issue in an essay called What Makes a Good Murder, when he lauds the old-fashioned murders of the 19th century over the crude and garish spectacle of gang killings. Pearson was publishing his true crime narratives during the era of Prohibition, when mobsters such as Al Capone came to dominate the criminal landscape of America. With his aesthetic sensibilities offended by the brutality of what he called the Chicago School of Murderers, Pearson's crime narratives turned back eagerly to the more civilized age of 19th century crimes. The philosophical and aesthetic questions raised by murder are of much more interest to Pearson than a gruesome account of the murders themselves. Pearson's determined refusal to engage with the crimes that dominated his own time may suggest that he wanted to elevate the genre of true crime out of history altogether by turning it into a disinterested object of aesthetic contemplation. But unlike De Quincey, Pearson engaged vigorously with contemporaneous debates about criminal responsibility, the insanity defense, the death penalty, and the causes of crime. The mixture of antiquarianism and contemporaneity that defines Pearson's true crime writing was probably the single most important reason for his success. His habit of concentrating on old cases helped to give true crime writing an air of respectability, while his involvement in the hot-button legal issues of the day gave true crime work a social utility that made reading it almost a civic duty, rather than evidence of the reader's prurience. It also helped, of course, that Pearson's views on law and order were quite conservative. Writing against a background of widespread police corruption and mobster lawlessness, as well as the popularization of the insanity defense, as used in the high-profile case of Leopold and Loeb in 1924, the year Pearson's first true crime book appeared, Pearson was a determined reactionary on the subject of criminal responsibility. He believed the appropriate fate for a convicted murderer was execution. At first, we might assume Pearson's defense of the death penalty and his attacks on the insanity defense are based on the belief that criminals are set definitively outside the community of law-abiding citizens. In fact, Pearson's support of the concept of criminal responsibility is dictated by his determination not to view criminals as monsters, separate from ordinary people. Pearson forces his readers to face the uncomfortable fact that the difference between them and the criminal is one of degree rather than kind. He insists on this point not to exonerate the criminal, but rather to encourage a clear-eyed attitude towards society's responsibility to punish the criminal. In this respect, the Puritans can be said to have had as much influence on Pearson as Thomas de Quincey. And it's this peculiar mixture of Puritanism and aestheticism that gives Pearson's work its distinctive flavor. By the end of Pearson's career in the 1930s, however, the industry of true crime writing had simply become too large to need the veneer of respectability. Instead, it was quite content to churn out gory and sensationalistic narratives for an eager public. However, another sea change for true crime was to take place, as we'll see if we now move on to the 1950s. For a book that would turn out to have such a huge impact, Truman Capote's In Cold Blood had modest beginnings. It was inspired by a 300-word article that ran on page 19 of the New York Times on Monday, November 16, 1959. The story described the unexplained murder of the Clutter family in rural Holcomb, Kansas. Fascinated by this brief news item, Capote traveled with his friend, Harper Lee, to Holcomb and visited the scene of the massacre. Over the course of the next few years, he became acquainted with everyone involved in the investigation and most of the residents of the small town. Rather than taking notes during interviews, Capote committed conversations to memory and immediately wrote quotes as soon as an interview ended. He claimed his memory retention for verbatim conversations had been tested at 94%. Capote spent years working on the book, which was published in 1966, and it turned out to be worth the effort. In Cold Blood was a huge international success, and it brought Capote a level of fame he had never enjoyed before. A writer of Capote's stature had never written true crime before, and it completely transformed the true crime genre. But the most controversial aspect of In Cold Blood was Capote's claim that his study of the murder of the Clutter family constituted a new genre, the nonfiction novel. This claim provoked heated debate among a wide range of critics and was largely responsible for the book's huge sales and the enormous amount of publicity that surrounded its publication. What exactly was new, if anything, about Capote's text compared to earlier true crime narratives? For one thing, Capote was much more engaged with the subjects of his narrative than any other writer of true crime up to that point. He developed a warm friendship with the two convicted murderers, Richard Hickok and Perry Smith, even accompanying them to the scaffold, weeping over their deaths, and paying for their grave markers. Although Capote spoke at length about his relationship with Smith and Hickok in interviews, the formal structure of In Cold Blood itself hides this engagement. By inventing the nonfiction novel, Capote claimed to have written a completely objective account of the case by scrupulously removing every trace of his presence from the text. Even though Capote spent nearly 6 years gathering information, researching, and living with the case, he appears nowhere in the book, and the word "I" is never used. Some reviewers complained about his apparent absence, claiming that it damaged the book. Far more serious, however, were the repeated accusations about the supposed factuality of In Cold Blood. Critics pointed to numerous examples of dialogue between characters that Capote couldn't possibly have known about, to argue that there was a good deal more fiction in Capote's book than he admitted. In the midst of the avalanche of success enjoyed by In Cold Blood, no one seemed to notice the absurdity of Capote boasting on the one hand about how scrupulous he had been about keeping himself out of his account, and yet, on the other hand, being more than happy to ride the tidal wave of publicity generated by the book. Rather than an inconsistency, however, this bizarre combination of invisibility and relentless self-publicizing is probably In Cold Blood's most profound influence on contemporary true crime narratives. Capote showed true crime writers how to participate in the culture of celebrity that had grown up around criminals. Indeed, in many ways, Capote set the stage for writers of true crime narratives to become even more famous than their subjects. No contemporary true crime writer is more popular and famous than Ann Rule, whose work exemplifies two very important features of contemporary true crime. First, the genre's recent and very successful preoccupation with serial killers, and second, the ways in which contemporary true crime shows the influence of earlier forms of the genre. Rule began trying to sell true crime work in 1963, but she didn't get her break until 1968, when True Detective offered her the position of Northwest stringer for the magazine. A stringer is a part-time contributor or correspondent. The editor liked Rule's work, but told her she'd have to use a male pseudonym because readers wouldn't believe a woman knew anything about murder. This is when she started using the pseudonym Andy Stack. After proving her ability in several magazines, Rule was invited to start writing under her own name, but decided to keep the pen name at that time in the interest of protecting herself and her family from her subjects. She came to prominence in 1980 with her first book, The Stranger Beside Me, about serial killer Ted Bundy. And over the course of a long and productive career until her death in 2015, she published over 20 books and 1,400 articles. Although some of her cases were high profile, such as the Bundy case, later in her career she preferred to write about what are known as sleeper cases, about which there hasn't been much media coverage, because she didn't want the reader to know the ending before picking up the book. She also tried to keep in touch with the families of the victims, and sometimes added updates to a later edition of a book to include new information. Despite her long and illustrious career, The Stranger Beside Me remains her most significant book, because it took both her career and the genre of true crime to a new level. To understand exactly why it's so significant, we have to understand how Rule's work compares to that of Pearson and Capote. Despite the many differences between Pearson and Rule, they do have certain things in common. They both write narratives about murder that, like true crime writing in general, can be said to have a therapeutic purpose. Although their methods are very different, Pearson and Rule share the constant aim of true crime writing: to make sense of murder by explaining how and why it happens. Despite these similarities, there are also some major differences. Rule's attitude toward murder, the degree of her empathic involvement in the cases she writes about, is completely different from Pearson's. And part of this difference can be explained by her role model in the genre. What Thomas de Quincey is to Pearson, Truman Capote is to Rule. As I mentioned earlier, when Capote published In Cold Blood, the rules for true crime changed forever. First, with his concept of the nonfiction novel, Capote provided a way for writers to justify fictional enhancement of the facts of any case. Second, by providing an exhaustive account of the murderer's psychological and family histories, Capote provided both a compelling cause and effect narrative with which to structure true crime accounts, and a way for the author to empathically portray the plight of the murderer as well as the victim. Unlike Pearson, who tends to treat murder as an intriguing puzzle, Rule customarily views murder as a dramatic family tragedy, whereas Pearson is completely uninterested in the murderer as a person. Rule is obsessed with getting inside the head of the murderer and dissecting their personal histories. Pearson and Rule thus have very different approaches to dramatizing the issues that concern them about murder. And this difference of approach leads to a number of other equally significant differences between them. Rule's interest in the personal histories of the murderers she discusses implies the weight she gives to environmental explanations of crime. Just as Capote believed that Hickok and Smith's family histories influenced their murder of the Clutter family, Rule believes her highly charged recreations of her killers' childhoods provide the answer to the question of why they killed. Pearson, on the other hand, was a particularly harsh critic of the view that one's social environment produced criminality. Concerned by what he interpreted as attacks on the principle of individual responsibility, he refused to believe that people could be swayed by outside forces, and criticized the tendency to rely on such forces for an explanation of crime. Although Rule doesn't pay much attention to the murderer's broader social environment, for example, the influence of pornography or violence in the media are rarely mentioned in her work, she does give great weight to the killer's family history. Pearson would have rejected this idea out of hand, but Rule sees her murderers as bound by an iron fate set in early childhood. From puberty on, her killers are just acting out a script written by somebody else, usually their parents. In short, for Pearson, responsibility for the murder begins and ends with the killer. For Rule, each killer is also in some sense a victim, so that their fate indicts a wider system of familial relations. It might seem then that Rule's true crime narratives are simply empathic, perhaps even sympathetic accounts of murderers, and that this is why they're so popular. However, this is not the whole story. It's true that Rule, unlike Pearson, uses true crime to provide a window on today's world rather than seeking refuge in an earlier time. However, the view she provides has to be carefully controlled in order to earn her readers' praise. Although the killer may in some sense be a sympathetic figure, Rule can't let the implied identity between killer and reader go too far, because it's too disturbing. The killer must be both like us and completely different from us. We must be able both to recognize him and to recognize our distance from him. This is the source of another significant difference between Pearson and Rule. Although Pearson was an anomalous figure in the 1920s and 1930s in his harsh criticism of environmental explanations of crime, he was up to date with a vengeance in his refusal to recognize an intrinsic physical or psychological difference between the criminal and non-criminal. Rule, on the other hand, relies far more on the belief that, although the criminal may look like us, he's somehow irreducibly different. Her work aims to convince us that despite the appearance of similarities between the life of the murderer and our own, that murderer is completely other, alien, abnormal. Therefore, Rule implies that we can be reassured about our own normality and be absolved of any guilt we may feel for reading true crime in the first place. Our guilt is the source of the last major difference between Pearson and Rule, and the final sign of how much the genre of true crime has changed over the course of time. When Pearson was writing, it wasn't considered inappropriate for him to appraise different murders according to aesthetic standards, or to enjoy murders as one might a fine wine. Although there was widespread concern in the 1920s about the rising tide of crime, most people were able to convince themselves that the violence took place amongst a minority of the population and that they were not implicated. By the 1970s and 1980s, this feeling of not being implicated was no longer tenable. Society's greatest truism was that violent crime was out of control, and the emergence of the figure of the serial killer at this time seemed to confirm the public perception that anyone could be victimized anytime, anywhere. Anne Rule rode the wave of this public paranoia about serial murder in particular, and violence in general, with The Stranger Beside Me. But she also had to find a way to channel this wave by making people feel that reading her books was a positive contribution to stopping crime, rather than a prurient participation in it. Rule addressed this problem by making her books implicit exercises in public policy. She argues that she writes about currently incarcerated serial killers to make sure they never get paroled. It was no longer enough, as it was in Pearson's time, to write about murder simply out of aesthetic interest. Rule tries to persuade her reader that true crime has an important role to play in fighting crime, by telling the reader both about the severity of the problem and why law enforcement personnel should be adequately supported in their attempts to solve it. The fact that Rule feels it necessary to do this, and that her readers responded so positively, speaks volumes about the changes in the true crime genre between the time of Edmund Pearson and that of Ann Rule. Let's return for a moment to how true crime writers like Rule present serial killers as monsters. The monstrosity of murderers in contemporary examples of the genre also dictates some more specific features of true crime narratives, many of which are driven by a desire to explain or disavow the killer's apparent ordinariness. One of the most common images in true crime narratives about serial killers is the mask of sanity. First published in 1941, The Mask of Sanity is a book written by Hervey Cleckley, MD, describing Cleckley's clinical interviews with adult male incarcerated psychopaths. It's considered a seminal work and the most influential clinical description of psychopathy in the 20th century. The title refers to the normal mask that conceals the mental disorder of the psychopathic person in Cleckley's conceptualization. The Mask of Sanity turns the killer's apparent ordinariness into the most compelling sign of his evil by depicting that ordinariness as a facade hiding the truth of his identity. According to popular perception, one of the most frightening characteristics of the serial killer is that he usually presents to the public the image of the all-American boy or the shy, quiet neighbor. The Mask of Sanity concept reassures us that the killer's apparent normality is false, and that underneath his benevolent appearance is a driven killer who stalks his prey with determined cunning. Although the presumption of monstrosity in true crime narratives is necessary in order to distance serial killers from ordinary men, it immediately creates a dilemma. How do we tell the difference between the mask of sanity and a real face? If serial killers appear to be ordinary men, how can we distinguish between apparently ordinary men who are actually serial killers and really ordinary men? These questions suggest that the mask of sanity as a diagnosis and sign of monstrosity is never enough. It always has to be bolstered by a second common feature of true crime narratives about serial killers: the search for the origins of deviance. This search is a distinctively recent innovation in true crime. Ann Rule's work on Bundy contains this feature, but then so does the vast majority of true crime work on serial killers. The search for origins often involves going back to seemingly innocuous childhood incidents and reinterpreting them in the light of later events. The most sustained example of what I call the had I but known school of true crime narratives is A Father's Story, Lionel Dahmer's memoir about his infamous son Jeffrey Dahmer, which is filled with examples of the ordinary turned into the ominous. For example, when Lionel Dahmer recounts a fishing trip with the young Jeffrey, he recalls his son's fascination with the fish's internal organs and asks whether this was a sign of things to come. All such questions are meant to be rhetorical. In the world of the true crime narrative, the lives of serial killers are bound by an inexorable logic that leads them to their crimes. We take great comfort in the deterministic logic that binds these children to their evil fate from their very earliest days. No matter how absurd this determinism may be, it has the advantage of making that apparently ordinary life as deviant as possible from its very beginning. To suggest any other possibility would risk having the ordinary be simply, well, ordinary. In some ways, the stakes of true crime narratives are higher than mystery and suspense fiction. Although both types of narrative address public anxiety and fascination with violence and crime, the true status of true crime makes those anxieties particularly intense. Yet these two genres also have many things in common, and the growth and continued popularity of true crime can shed light on why mystery and suspense fiction has also been able to maintain its appeal with so many readers.